Tshikululu Social Investments, the country's leading social investment fund management and advisory firm, has undertaken a survey of over 170 NPOs around South Africa to assess the effect that COVID-19 has had on this crucial sector. And joining us to speak on the study is Tamika Mtega from Tshikululu Social Investment. Thank you so much for your time and joining us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Lovely. So the study notes that 66% of respondents have experienced a decline in income since lockdown and anticipate things to remain difficult over the next 18 months. Yet, 60% of NGOs did not apply for relief funding. Now, I think maybe let's start off with why you thought it was so crucial to begin this report and what this kind of these kinds of declines could sort of mean in response to what NPOs are currently going through and have been going through.
Yes, of course. So firstly, in looking at the survey and why we decided to run the survey in the first place was that NGOs are in a unique position during the COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent lockdown in the sense that they face a double burden. NGOs have the burden of, increased demand for their services, given the need at the current time, but also, as the survey indicates, with 66% decline in their income. So they have to meet a greater need with less resources available to them. And we also felt as though, the challenges the NPO sector was facing weren't really being highlighted. Yeah. And we thought that the survey would help give a voice to these NPOs, which are, working through challenging times, but at the same time doing very important work.
Yeah, I think it is very important to highlight that voice, because I do think there's been some studies internationally, but nothing really locally, and I found that to be quite interesting. What kind of impact does a staff reduction what kind of impact does staff reduction have on just a general NPO, and what do you think it has on such a massive scale?
Yes, so I can't speak to individual NGOs, but I can maybe speak to the overall results that the survey has told us and then maybe draw some conclusions from there. But from the survey, we saw that 35% of organizations took steps like laying off staff temporarily, reducing working hours, or reducing salaries. And obviously that has the human effect on the actual staff themselves, but at the same time, it also has an effect on the capacity of these organizations. As I mentioned, NPOs, they face the greater need and burden during this time, but then they face the additional challenges of a decline in resources, not only being financially, but then staffing, as you mentioned.
100%. And in your understanding, what is going to be the next jumpstart for NPOs right now, as we're looking at level 1 and we're looking at some sort of normalcy? What do you see actually working out in contrast to what you found, or in relation to what you found in the survey?
Yes, of course. So in the survey, in the report, we have 7 recommendations for NPOs and social investors. And I'll go through the recommendations maybe by, as they are relevant as to what you said in terms of jumpstarting the NPO industry. So the first is partnership, both from the side of social investors and NPOs. Partnership is an important aspect, mainly for the fact that it's much easier to strengthen and maintain your relationships with current funders and current NPOs than it is to go out looking for new partners. So we think that's a very important step to take. The second is scenario planning. COVID-19 has taught us you can't prepare for everything, but from what has been learned in the current pandemic and the lockdown is scenario planning in the long term, and we're aware that the economic effects of the pandemic are likely to be long term and not just over once we're in level 1. Then third is to look at the lessons learned. There are plenty of lessons learned that NPOs have likely encountered, and we encourage NPOs to document these lessons learned and build a sort of database of institutional knowledge. The fourth is engaging with the government, applying for relief funding where it's available, and being proactive in looking for funding. There is funding available, but the access to information in the NPO sector isn't the greatest. So organizations need to be proactive in partnering with government, looking for relief funding, etc. And 5 is focusing on internal resilience, finding ways to creatively and meaningfully engage staff and beneficiaries, during this tough time where there's an extra burden placed on each of those groups. The 6th is to focus on data and improve, monitoring and evaluations. And the 7th is to seize opportunities by adjusting, perhaps their service offering to current needs, looking at ways to access, for example, COVID-19 specific relief funding.
How do NGOs access the study?
how do NPOs access the study? The study is on Tshikululu's website at tshikululu.org, and the full report is on the website.
Okay, 100%. And just lastly, I know that we obviously want to end off this conversation with a bit of optimism. What kind of experience do you think, or what kind of future should NGOs be hopeful about, just based on the study? I think there's a lot of things that came out about what they need to do, but is there an actual set, optimism as to, the state of NGOs, how it was before COVID and after?
So in terms of optimism, and what we found in this study was that, obviously it's a very challenging time, and we don't want to sort of look at the silver lining when there's a lot to focus on in terms of the challenges and lessons learned there. But what we did find is that there were a lot of organizations that found ways to look at new ways of working, and perhaps some of the challenges that came about during COVID-19 highlighted ways that NGOs could work better. So perhaps reaching beneficiaries who are refugees or aren't specifically South African residents, organizations that found new ways of working, such as reaching beneficiaries through WhatsApp groups, working within communities and strengthening their stakeholder relationships, or maybe points of optimism that are helpful to highlight, in terms of lessons learned going forward.
100%. Thank you so much for your time, Tamika. This has been so insightful, and I really do hope that the study does change, the state of NGOs right now, post-COVID or just after COVID, so that we can see a little bit more of involvement in our communities. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
For more stories like these, go to www.social-tv.co.za. Subscribe to us on YouTube and follow us on our social mediums.